When the gods came to Island the Tuatha, descending from the sky in a great cloud upon the Iron Mountain, they offered the people already there, the Verbolg, to split this great green fertile land 50-50, for the land was far bigger than the Verbolg themselves needed. And they offered to the Verbolg wisdom and knowledge and understanding and technologies and all manner of things. Except the Verbolg didn't want what the gods were offering. They wanted to keep the land entirely for themselves, and they feared that if they were to yield half of it today, then tomorrow or next week or next month or next year, these incomers, these strangers, would want more and more and more. And so, under the leadership of King Shreng, the Verbolg went to war against the Tuatha. They raged at them across the plain of pillars, and the first battle of Moitura was fought amidst great bloodshed and death and loss on either side. And it ended with the killing of the king of the Verbolg and the signing of a peace treaty, but it also ended with the mutilation, the maiming of Nuatha, the king of the gods. He lost his hand, and such was the law of the incoming peoples that no maimed or mutilated king could sit upon the throne. So Nuatha had to step down as king and become another aristocrat with no more influence than any other. And a new king was sought in the peace building after the war between the two great people. But there was a third peoples, not quite so much in Ireland as around Ireland. There were the Vamori, the people of the goddess Domnu, she who lives in the great, deep, dark abyss, the ocean trenches that go down and down and down into darkness, where the beings that live there are strange and tentacled and scaled and finned and fanged, deep ones, dark ones, strange ones, none stranger than Domnu the Queen herself. But not all members of this ancient race are as perverse in appearance as the tentacled and fanged and finned ones that I have just described. There are some who are not without a degree of personability. And it was one such of these who had become the father of Brez the Beautiful, Brez the wonderful, the amazing, the magnificent. At least he was all of those things in his own mind. And admittedly, he was a very beautiful man, if you measure beauty only in terms of cheekbones and wavy hair and cleft chins, and you look no deeper for character within. And it was suggested as the third race that encircle Ireland with its oceans as their domain, that a better peace could be brokered by placing a king upon the throne of Ireland who was part Tuatha and part Vamori. The Verbolg themselves had been consigned not to half of Ireland as the initial treaty offered to them involved, but to 1/5, the Tuatha taking the other 4/5 for themselves. And there were many who said that the fifth given to the Verbolg was the least productive, the least fertile, the least inhabitable sector of Ireland in that day and age, though it was to become much more habitable in the time ahead. But for now, let us leave the Verbolg to one side, for having placed Brez the Beautiful upon the throne, his rulership was as shallow and misguided as one might expect from a man whose beauty is only skin deep. He sets the wisest and the wonderfulest and the most powerful of the gods to tasks ill-suited to them, that failed to use their skills, their jun, their natural gifts and talents. And this is an unwise thing to do. And so the gods became disgruntled. They became yet more disgruntled when Brez made the mistake that almost every ruler in the world, no matter what part of the world we look at, has made, of overtaxing the population to pay for his own excesses, and the excesses of his family in the ocean depths, who wanted jewels and furs and fine silks and linens and great ornate shields and swords and all the things that cost an absolute fortune to provide. And so people had become more and more and more disgruntled with Brez's rulership, until the day when Kebra, the great bard, had come visiting the court of Brez, expecting to be treated in the extravagant way that bards were in that day and age, wined and dined and schmoozed prior to reciting his poems and telling his stories. Instead, he was shunted off to a cattle shed, and a particularly filthy cattle shed at that, and fed the most meagre of foods, and no wines or meads for him, but just somewhat stagnant cold water. And so great was his fury, his indignation, that he recited a curse, a poetic curse, upon Brez the Beautiful, whose skin-deep looks dissolved in a sea of suppurating pustules and boils. And again, the law that had forbidden Nuatha from continuing in his kingship with a missing arm equally forbade Brez continuing his kingship with a disfigured face and a disfigured body. So he too was shown the door of the royal palace, and went storming back to the Vamori half of his family, raging and roaring and demanding that something be done about this indignation, legal indignation, but indignation nonetheless. And thus began the second great battle of Moitura. Only this time it was not between the Vabolog with their spears and clubs, but between the Vamori with their expensive swords and tridents and axes and all manner of death-dealing weapons, and the gods themselves. And the battle raged, and it raged, and it raged, day after day after day, sometimes upon the plain of pillars, blood splattering up the great stone menhirs that could be found by the dozens across the plain of pillars, earning it that very name. And sometimes in other locations, as the Vamori slobbered and emerged from the ocean depths and fought the gods upon the beaches and upon the mountains and in the forests and in the swamps of Ireland. Many died on both sides, and it seemed to look as if no solution were to be found. For under the leadership of King Indech, the great Vamori leader, who was not only terrifying of appearance and mien when his true self was revealed, but a great strategist, a great warrior, fierce and ferocious and cunning and stealthy, it looked as if the tide might turn against the gods themselves, that they might be slaughtered or at least driven out of Ireland. And those who had been formerly ill-used and put to unsuited tasks by Brez now came forward to the great court, and each volunteered their skills of what they would do. And the Dagda, the great burly, bearded, jovial giant of a god, this Irish Santa Claus of a god, said he would go and spy upon the camps of the Vamori and see what they were up to. And strange as it may be to imagine so huge and burly a god being able to sneak quietly and sneakily like a fox through the shadows and observe what was going on, nonetheless that is what he did. For though he was great of girth, he was also great of brain and great of magic, and knew how to work a spell or two in his favour. Off he slipped until he came to the banks of the River Unius that flows through Ireland, a great vast wide river, and there this great burly giant of a god saw a great giantess of a goddess. He saw a woman standing with a foot on either bank of the river, and there with her great long pitch black tresses cascading down her back, cascading down to the very waters themselves. She seemed to merge into the water, or perhaps emerge from the water, may be a better way of putting it. Dark as a raven's wing, The goddess Morrigan herself, the queen of battle, stood there. She who is older than the Tuatha had been in Ireland before them. She stood there and she welcomed the Dagda, and she made a deal to him that if he would meet her demands, she would fight not on the side of the Vamori, but on the side of the Tuatha. She would give them her ferocity, her passion, her strength, and she boasted of many of the things she would achieve in battle, not least of which was to rip 2 great handfuls of blood from the very heart of King Indech, and to take the courage from his liver, from his lights, and reduce him to a quivering, gibbering mess. And what, asked the great Dagda, do you wish in exchange? Why, none other than that on this, the very eve of Samhain, the very day at the end of the year before the beginning of the next, the time that is out of time, the time when the gates to the lands of the dead open, and the spirits that are contained within the she mounds ride forth across Ireland, that at this time you lay with me in this very river, in this very spot. Are you up for it? And of course the Dagda was always up for it. And so the 2 of them straddled the riverbanks, she still keeping an ankle on either banks as she lay back into the river, the waters flowing over her body, spreading her hair out in a great dark slick from her head, with the Dagda atop of her, grunting and sweating, but let's not think of that in too much detail. A thunderous mating it was. The waters of the river were churned for hours upon hours, for these are gods of which we speak. And the passion felt by both the Morrigan and the Dagda caused plants to come into blossom, and trees into fruit and into nut, and birds and beasts to begin to reproduce out of their natural seasons. Such was the passion that rippled throughout the land. And as the gateways of the she mounds opened up, not only did the ghostly spectres of the dead come out, the werewolves and the creatures of darkness, but also the creatures of joy and the creatures of light. And together the light and the dark danced across Ireland that very night. And when at length the Dagda rolled off the Morrigan, and they both lit up a fag and said, how's it for you? Did Ireland move? And Ireland had moved. The Morrigan cleansed herself in the river and said, the deal is done. Your people are now of mine, as I am of yours. You are wed to the land, truly wed to the land. And off you must go to continue your spying journey, and off he went. And when at length, which is a whole other story, he gathered all manner of useful information from his spying trip upon the Vamori, he returned to the court of the Tuatha. And there were all of the gods and the goddesses of the people of the sky who had descended down, and there was the raven goddess herself. There was the Morrigan, the great and ancient black-winged crow. There, each in turn pledged to use their sword arm for this and their spear arm for that, to use their magic to rain down fire upon the enemy, or conjure up the rivers to drown the enemy. Each pledged their own unique powers and skills, and the Morrigan once again echoed the pledges that she would take. And come the culminating day of the great battle, Tuatha and Vamori met again upon the plain of pillars, and this time the blood was knee-deep, and all of the pledges were fulfilled bar one. For when the Morrigan came to snatch 2 great fistfuls of blood from Indech and kill him, she discovered that Ogma, wise, gentle, learned, bookish Ogma, who was more usually to be found in a library poring over ancient texts and reciting poems and stories beneath an oak tree, was now stood athwart the corpse of King Indech, who he had taken on single-handed in battle and fought, and the bookish god had triumphed, but nonetheless the Morrigan snatched 2 handfuls of blood from the corpse. Thank you.